I'm Dr. Yvonne Cason, the president of Spiritual Awakenings International. Welcome, everybody from around the world, wherever you're joining us from. We are absolutely delighted at how Spiritual Awakenings International has grown in the 4 years since we launched. We're currently in 96 countries around the world. So please take a moment and enter into the chat where you're joining us from today. I am joining you from Toronto, Canada, and our speaker today, Rick Archer, is joining us from, he'll tell us, somewhere in the central time zone in the United States. Anyway, so we're welcome everyone wherever you're joining us from. So today it is my great pleasure to introduce Rick Archer. Rick is the creator and host of the interview show, Buddha at the Gas Pump. Since 2009, he has interviewed over 700 spiritually awakening people from all kinds of backgrounds. Now, Rick himself learned Transcendental Meditation when he was 18 and was trained by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi as a Transcendental Meditation teacher. He went on and earned a bachelor and master's degree in Vedic studies from the Maharishi International University. He served as a TM teacher for 25 years. Today, Rick is no longer associated with the TM organization, and he says he's become too eclectic and independent to affiliate exclusively with just one organization. Rick Archer is also a founder of the Association for Spiritual Integrity, which I'm sure we're going to hear about today. So today's format, at Rick's request, is going to be a bit more informal than usual. I will be interviewing Rick, and please feel free, if you have any questions for Rick, to put them into the chat anytime during today's presentation, and I will do my best to answer that question. So let's start with me asking our dear guest, Rick Archer, if he could please tell us about your own spiritual awakening journey, Rick.
Okay, I'm going to include my entire lifetime in that answer, and cover a bunch of autobiographical stuff, and then we'll get into some broader principles as we go along. So I was born in October of 1949, which means I'll be 75 in October of this year. And my parents met at art school. They were both creative people. They had both been in the military in World War II. And my father, in particular, suffered from severe PTSD as a result of the war, although I don't think they called it that in those days. And he was an alcoholic, and he also had some form of epilepsy and took drugs, phenobarbital and dilantin, for his epilepsy. And I don't think those mixed too well with alcohol. In any case, he stayed out drinking several nights a week and came home drunk and verbally abused my mother for half the night, which kept us kids awake and made it tough to go to school the next day and all. On the other hand, he was very creative. As I said, he had an organic garden throughout the 1950s, which few people did in those days, I guess. And he was always sculpting or painting or, cooking. He was a very good cook. He took me skiing, took me on Boy Scout camping trips and fishing and things like that. So I think maybe what I've just told you so far might have been the beginnings of my appreciation of paradox, which is one of my favorite words, and that people are not black and white. They're not all good or bad. They're mixed bags. And he had a very heavy load to carry. I might have been the same way if I had been manning a machine gun in the tail of a bomber in World War II. But in any case, childhood was a bit rough. I think I'll share a screen, a picture here. This is a picture of me and my sisters when I guess I was about 6 or so, and my sisters, Kathy and Carol. Carol lives here in Fairfield. Kathy on the left is out in Colorado. Stop sharing. So I had an interesting childhood. We lived in beautiful places, Westport and Fairfield, Connecticut, quarter of a mile from Long Island Sound, and so skiing in the winter, swimming in the summer. As I was telling the hosts here a little earlier that I had a natural inclination to be a drummer, and I wanted to start playing drums when I was 4, but I didn't manage to get a drum set until I was 14. But I was always pounding on things, pots and pans and stuff like that. And I joined several bands I joined a band days after I got my drums. I go for a new screen share on that here. Let me just see. Ding, ding. There we go. This was called we started this one calling it Little Louie and the Tympanum Blasters. That was Little Louie on the left. And my father painted the bass drum, and he wasn't going to put all that on it. And so we changed it to the Tympanics. This was a picture of me playing. Another band, I went to a prep school for a year. This was the band that I had going after I learned to meditate, which actually became quite successful. And the lead guitarist became a professional jazz musician. Anyway, so as I got a little older, into my adolescence, my father's treatment of my mother took a toll on her, and she swallowed all my father's phenobarbital and almost died, and then tried that several times throughout my adolescence. And I kind of left home more or less when I was 14 and moved in with a very permissive family who had 7 kids, and we could do whatever we wanted there. So, smoking, drinking, taking drugs, sex, whatever was available. And there was plenty of all that available in the late 60s. I ended up dropping out of high school because I was just too confused and untogether. That family moved to New Jersey, and and convinced me to come down there and stay with them there and get into another high school, which I also dropped out of and hitchhiked to California with a friend. And then the band I was in at the time got to spend the night with Jimi Hendrix in his hotel room. And they called me up and said, "You got to come back. We're getting the band back together." So they sent me a plane ticket, came back, and we were all still doing so much drugs that we didn't know what we were doing. But finally, one night, in the July of '68, I was sitting in the basement of my parents' home. By this time, I had started to get into hard drugs a little bit. And in fact, I have Hep C antibodies in my system. And I picked up a Zen book because I was actually into spirituality. A year before, when we were preparing to take LSD for the first time, some friends of mine were reading Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert's translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and they mentioned enlightenment. And I thought, enlightenment? Yeah, it kind of hit me. It rang a bell. I thought, in some muddled way, I thought, that's what you're supposed to do in life. And when we did take LSD, I kind of, it certainly wasn't a taste of enlightenment, but it did show me something I had never realized, which is that everybody sees the world differently. I'd always assumed that we all saw the same world. And so I thought, well, so the trick is you have to change your perspective on the world, not necessarily change the world, although you can try to do that too. But the big thing is to change the way you see the world, the way you perceive things. And so anyway, after a year of fooling around, that night on LSD, reading a Zen book, it just hit me. I thought, these guys were serious, and I'm just screwing around. And if I keep on going this way, I'm not going to live a very long life. And I'm also probably going to damage my body, and I'm stuck in this body. And if I damage it, I'll be stuck in a damaged body. So I thought, all right, that's it. I'm going to stop taking drugs. I'm going to learn Transcendental Meditation, and I'll see what happens. So 2 weeks later, I learned TM, and I took to it like a duck to water. I immediately had a beautiful, profound experience, felt like a ton had been lifted off my shoulders, and just had this sort of subtle, deep vow in a way to just do it regularly and see what happened. And as you can tell from what I've said so far, I was not the type of person to do things regularly. My life is very irregular, but how many years later now, what is it? 56 years later or something, I still haven't missed a meditation. I'm no longer in the TM movement. I'll talk about that later, but I just stuck to it regularly. So anyway, I kept doing that, and things started coming together. I got back in school, got a job, got a girlfriend, got into this band, the last picture that I showed you. And, I was all of a sudden quite productive and got a high school equivalency diploma and then into a community college and later into another college. And I soon began to want to become a teacher of it. So I went to a couple of courses, and then I went to a 2.5 month course in Estes Park, Colorado, and became a teacher and began teaching. And in my first year and a half or so, I taught maybe 800 or 900 people, which made me one of the most successful teachers in the country. Part of which is due to the fact that I had a very good area to teach in. It was Fairfield County, Connecticut. People were educated and wealthy, and it wasn't too big of a territory to cover. So I raced around like a maniac, and courses here, courses there, zooming back and forth. It's amazing I didn't have a car wreck. I used to drive so fast. And because I was so successful teaching, and I sound like I'm bragging now, but I'm trying to just be factual, they promoted me to be what was called a regional lecturer. So I started traveling around. I was like, 22 years old or something. Started traveling around New York State and some other parts of the Northeast, giving larger lectures, and then the local teachers would teach the people and teaching weekend retreats to people. I must have taught 75 of those or so. And meanwhile, while all this is happening, every 4.5 months, we'd go off to Mallorca or Switzerland or someplace and do a 6-month long meditation course. And so I went off to Switzerland to do one of those. And at the end of it, Maharishi asked me to stay and to go up to Belgium and help conduct a teacher training course, which I did. And I'm going to share my screen. So, boom. So here's a picture that was taken at the end of that teacher training course. You can see me in the lower right with my prominent nose looking sideways. And I stayed there in what was called international staff in Europe, mostly Switzerland, and a little bit France and some other countries, and spent a lot of time around Maharishi, whom I adored. There's a picture of me with him. And after about 2.5 years, I went back to the States and got involved in various projects. But while I was over there, I met my wife. I'm going to share my screen again. Here she is after we got married, which was about 37 years ago. Her name is Irene. Most of you have heard of her who watch Batgap. But Maharishi had instilled in us the notion that if you're really adamant about enlightenment, you should be celibate. You should be a monk. And so, when he first said that, I hadn't met my wife, but I very rudely and unceremoniously dropped my girlfriend at the time. I still feel guilty about that, the way I treated her, and embarked on the attempt to be a monk and had visions of ultimately living in the Himalayas. And that went on for 15 years, 12 of which were after I had met Irene. And, we had had this chemistry, but I kept saying, oh, I love you, but I gotta be a monk because it's the best thing you can do. And, and then finally at 1987, I kind of like, although my intellect and my friends were all saying, no, you got to keep doing this, my heart and my intuition said, hey, yeah, enough of this. It's time to leave. So I left that monastic program, which wasn't exclusive. It wasn't like, living in a cave. And we were traveling around the world to Iran and the Philippines and all kinds of places doing these projects, but a lot of long meditation courses too. Anyway, we left and got married, which was kind of a cold turkey marriage. In other words, going straight from monastic programs, because she was on the female equivalent, right into marriage with not the usual courtship and all that stuff. Although we had our radar on each other for 12 years. But anyway, that was a bit of an adjustment, but we adjusted slowly but surely over the years. And then I did various other things with her, projects, traveling around, teaching, lecturing, working at the Maharishi International University, and all kinds of things like that. but eventually we kind of felt like this is not a life, living in some dorm room. And we decided to leave the university's employment and move into town. And I did computer consulting. I did desktop publishing, which I had taught at the university, some web design, search engine optimization. Then around end of the last century, or late 90s, early 2000s, um, a load of information came to my attention, which I had always heard rumors about, but had always dismissed and had answers for. That in fact, despite his advocacy of celibacy and his claim that he was a life celibate, Maharishi in fact had numerous relationships over the course of his public career. And instead of dismissing the rumors, as I always had, I decided, okay, I'm going to take a look at this and see what the truth of it is. And I apologize to any TM people around for whom this is an uncomfortable topic, but the information is really out there these days. So I talked to some of his personal secretaries. I talked to 4 of the women who had been involved, and there were many more, but I talked to 4. And I just came to terms with the fact that, okay, that was true. But as I said with regard to my father, I didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because he had so many marvelous qualities. And I've just described to you the effect that his teachings had on my life, basically saved it and enhanced it in so many ways and resulted in so many wonderful adventures around the world, that unlike some people who did have a kind of a, negative black and white, all or nothing reaction to that information, I tried to kind of contain it within a larger understanding. And it instilled in me an appreciation of, a greater appreciation of paradox and of nuance and of the recognition that we're all works in progress and nobody is perfect and everybody's growing. One of my favorite quotes is from Saint Teresa of Avila. She said, "It appears that God himself is on the journey." So that's what I did. But it did instill in me. Oh, I should add, one of the reasons I'm so appreciative of Maharishi, aside from the benefits he brought me through his teachings, was that he basically saved my mother's life. I mentioned that she had 3 suicide attempts. And when I was over there in Switzerland, I more or less had arm twisted her into learning meditation when I was back in Connecticut, but she didn't take to it. But I was over there and I didn't know what was going on with her, but we were sending audio tapes back and forth. And she had been sliding into another breakdown and beginning to hallucinate and stuff. And she thought, well, maybe I should try to meditate and it'll help me. So she sat down and had a really nice meditation and felt a lot better. And so she started doing it regularly, but I didn't know this. And I assumed she was in some hospital or whatever was going on. And she had sent me a tape in which she had told me all that, but since I was moving around, I hadn't received that tape. And then I got another one in which she said, well, I'm either going out to California to be with Carol, my sister, who was at MIU, the Maharishi University out there at the time, or I'm coming to Switzerland. And I was like, oh my God, through my whole adolescence, this whole thing had been weighing on me, my mother's situation, and what could I do? And I'd asked Maharishi about it several times. And it was, and I had been going to visit her in the mental hospital so many times when I was back in Connecticut. And it was this huge, wonderful celebratory moment. So anyway, the next day I asked Maharishi if she could come, and he said, sure, let her come. And I said, well, what would she do? And he said, doesn't matter, just let her come. And I said, maybe she can take care of children. No, she doesn't have to do that. Just let her come. So she came over a few weeks later. And when the first night that she was there, we were standing in the hall and he came walking in, and there's people lined up. You've probably been in situations like this, people lined up on either side. He's walking up this little aisle, and people are giving him flowers and he's greeting people and stuff. So he got to us. But the first thing she said when she saw him come in the room is, he's so short. I didn't realize he was so short. But anyway, he got up to us and she gave him a flower. He gave her a flower. He looked at me and he said, keep her happy, and a little chit chat. And then he went and sat on his couch. And she turned to me. Her face was like awestruck. And she said, he looks right into your soul. And so anyway, she stayed there 9 months, and she had some wonderful adventures there too, traveling around Europe and stuff. And it really strengthened her. And she was a different person ever since then. She came back to the States, ended up moving here to Iowa. That's where I am, by the way, Fairfield, Iowa. And you know, had, her ups and downs, but because she'd really been through a lot in her life, but it was a far cry from what it had been when she was in and out of hospitals. And anyway, so for that reason alone, I'm extremely grateful. But okay, so let's move along here. So about 15 years ago, well, prior to that, for quite a few years, I had been participating in this little satsang or spiritual discussion group here in town. Every Wednesday night, we'd sit around for a few hours in the small living room packed with people, and we just talk about our experiences and so on. And there were a lot of people here in town, where people have been meditating for decades, who had had significant spiritual development and awakenings, and they would talk about them, but they were reluctant to talk about them outside that room, because they had experienced that when they did so, their friends would often dismiss them as being, delusional. Yeah, how could you claim to have a spiritual awakening? You can't float off the ground, or you don't look like, I can't see any big bright aura around you, or whatever. They'd think that this is just an ordinary person, and how can an ordinary person have a profound spiritual awakening? I know this guy, but I knew they were having them, and so the idea dawned on me to start interviewing some of these people, so that others could see that ordinary people like them were having spiritual awakenings. And if it could happen to these people, it could happen to them. And so initially I conceived of it as a radio show. There's a little low power FM radio station here in town. And if you go back, you can look at the very first Bat Gap interview, and that's where we did it, in the radio studio. But the radio station didn't want to make it a regular show. And so, then friends encouraged me to start taping them at a local public access TV station. So I did a bunch of them and didn't know what I was going to do with them. But then a friend, my old buddy from high school, who had been a video professional, got in touch and said, "Hey, send them to me. I'll turn them into things that you can post on the internet." So, I've created a YouTube channel, figured out how to create a website, and posted a bunch, and then just started doing them regularly, and eventually figured out how to do them long distance. We didn't have Zoom in those days, and there were all kinds of technical challenges, but we just kind of met one challenge after another, and the thing started to take off, and and become more and more popular, and more people started getting in touch saying they wanted to be interviewed, or we sometimes reach out to people. And if you look at the testimonials page on batgap.com, you'll see all kinds of beautiful stories from people which came to us unsolicited about the impact it's had on their lives. So, I feel very grateful to have been able to serve in this capacity. And it's been, tremendously beneficial for me, as well as for apparently many of the people who've watched them. Now, as a result of this, issue that I described with Maharishi, I did, and also the experience I've had over the years of doing this, of being aware of so many instances of spiritual teachers who fall short in the ethics department, and in various ways. I've grown in my appreciation of the importance of ethics on the spiritual path, both for the sake of teachers and for the sake of their students. I think it is extremely destructive for a teacher himself to behave unethically, the karmic implications and all that. And it can be extremely disillusioning to students. I know people who have literally committed suicide because they were so disillusioned by the betrayal of a spiritual teacher. And so the issue has interested me more and more over the years. And I think it was 2017, I gave a talk at the Science and Non-Duality Conference on the ethics of enlightenment. And my friend Jack O'Keefe was in the audience, and a bunch of other people. And afterwards, Jack and a fellow named Craig Holliday and I had lunch together, and we were just chatting because it turned out that they also had given talks at the conference, unbeknownst to each other and to me, on the same topic. So we got together for lunch, and we thought we conceived of the idea of starting an organization, which eventually became called the Association for Spiritual Integrity, the purpose of which would be to not to wield some kind of authority or to pass judgment on people or to revoke people's teaching certificates, because there is no such thing, but just to raise awareness of the importance of ethics on the spiritual path. I feel that spiritual awakening is kind of epidemic in the world. There's a kind of a rising tide of consciousness throughout the world, and that is kind of welling up from a very deep level, but at the same time facilitated by the internet and our modern means of communication, and that it may just be the hope of the world. I think that every problem or anything, positive or negative, that we see manifesting on the world stage in societies is just a reflection or a manifestation of the collective consciousness of all the people in the world. And that collective consciousness is made up of the individual consciousness of all those 7 or 8 billion people, just as a forest is made up of trees. And if all the trees in a forest are withering and dying, you fly over it, it'll look like a brown, gray forest. But if all the trees are healthy, it'll look green. And you can't spray paint the forest green to make it healthy, which is, I think, what some of our attempts at correcting societal problems do. It has to come from within. So, lots of individuals undergoing profound individual change and rising toward higher states of consciousness will inevitably result in a better world in all kinds of ways that we can't even possibly foresee. Things that are wrong will perhaps start to correct themselves, and new creative ideas could come up that could solve some of our critical problems and all kinds of things. So anyway, that's been my thinking since I became a meditation teacher in 1970, and I've always tried to devote myself to helping in whatever way I could to raise collective consciousness. And this whole Buddha at the gas pump thing has been a great way of my being able to contribute to that. So where was I going? I had a point. Oh, yes. And the point was that I think that ethical lack of appreciation and adherence to ethical standards among spiritual teachers it kind of sabotages the effort of this raising of collective consciousness, shoots it in the foot, so to speak. And I think that helping to raise awareness of the importance of ethics on the spiritual path will help to facilitate this collective awakening. So as I said a minute ago, the ASI doesn't have any kind of authority or anything like that, but we consider ourselves really an educational organization. We have webinars. We've spoken at conferences at Harvard twice now, and Harvard Divinity School, and also at the Parliament of World Religions last summer. And we have well over 600 members and maybe about 35 member organizations now who have joined, and it continues to grow. Let me think. I think I have my next slide is yeah, here it is. I'm going to share this. There we go. So this is just a slide of the ASI website, and I put the URL up here so you can see it. And if you'd like to go to that later, and you could sign up to become a member. We have, as I said, we have webinars and so on that you might enjoy participating in. So that's my second major activity. And then there are lots of things going on with BatGap. Aside from the interviews, I've been very much involved for the past year in building a AI chatbot Oh, and David B put a link to batgap.com in the chat, which I didn't show, but it's batgap.com, BATGAP. Yeah, so I've been involved in building an AI chatbot for Batgap in the past year, with the collaborating with a fellow named Nipun Mehta from an organization called Service Space. And I've uploaded tens of thousands of relevant documents to the data corpus of the chatbot. And we're soon going to add 1,700 spiritual literature, traditional spiritual books like the Bible, the Upanishads, and 1,700 others from all traditions into the data corpus of the chatbot. So it'll be kind of like I mean, I'll explain this very briefly and then move on. But things like ChatGPT, they're horizontal in the sense that they scarf up all the information on the internet, and you can ask them questions about anything, which is great. But this is more of a vertical as opposed to a horizontal chatbot because it specializes in the kind of stuff we're interested in here, spiritual development and spirituality and so on. And so you're likely to get better answers if you ask it questions of a spiritual nature than if you ask the same questions of one of the more general chatbots. Anyway, I'm kind of a computer geek, and aside from being a spiritual geek, and so this kind of is a nice dovetail of interests that I've been enthusiastic about recently. All right, this would be a good time to pause for a question or more.
All right. Thank you, Rick. That was really fascinating. And I do have a few questions. First off, let's go back to when you went to the Maharishi University. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, where is it? What is it like? Were there lots of students there? Who taught your courses? What exactly did you learn there? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's here in Fairfield, Iowa, and it's been here since the early 70s. Started out in Santa Barbara, California in a rented facility, but then it moved, they found an abandoned campus here and moved the whole thing here. And I taught desktop publishing there, as I mentioned, but then I also became a student and took courses in what was called the science of creative intelligence, the basic premise of which is that there is sort of an all-pervading fundamental intelligence governing the universe, which I suppose in religious terms you could call God, but that it can be explored and understood more scientifically, that you could empirically investigate it through direct experience, and also some of the other criterion of the scientific method could be used to understand it better. And so I got bachelor's and master's degrees in that, which I've used the term Vedic studies because it was very much that also. And that's probably better understood than science of creative intelligence, which is a mouthful to explain. And the faculty members were people that, like myself, were long-term meditators, but had more academic credentials than I did. And there were quite a few students in those days. These days, the whole thing has dwindled a bit, and I think the university itself is being shaken by some of the allegations that I mentioned earlier, and they're going to have to come to terms with that somehow. The lifeblood of the university in recent years has been students from Africa and places like that coming to study computer science and then getting jobs in the US and then having their wages garnered to pay their tuition retroactively. But there's also a very popular Ayurveda program that my brother-in-law heads up, and has several hundred students. And it's probably the most popular program of its kind that I know of in the country. I think that's the most popular program at the university at the moment. So that's a bit more about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Now, we've had a couple people asking the same question, which is, how did you come up with the name Buddha at the gas pump?
Well, actually, I didn't. When I was in that Wednesday night group that I told you about, before I conceived of this, there was a young fellow there who was one of the participants. And when I told the group I wanted to start doing this thing, I said, help me brainstorm on a name. And he just spat out about a dozen possible ideas. And everybody said, "Oh, Buddha at the gas pump, that's got to be it." Yeah, we like that. So we called it that. And it may have been an allusion to the Celestine Prophecy, I think it was called, where there was some character, or was it The Way of the Peaceful Warrior? Maybe that was it. Way of the Peaceful. There was some character who was sort of an enlightened dude, and he was at a gas station and he levitated up on the roof of the gas station or something like that. I don't know if that's where he got the idea, but the reason we like the idea, the name, is that it implies what I was trying to say earlier, that spiritual awakening is not for extraordinary people, at least not exclusively, that it's really everyone's birthright, and that you could be pumping gas at a gas station or maybe charging up your Tesla at a charging station, and the person next to you might be in a quite, exalted state of consciousness, and you never know it. It doesn't necessarily, broadcast in a gross way. It's a subtle thing. So anyway, that's why we chose the name.
Awesome. Ingeborg has a question for you. She said, have you ever heard of the lecture by George Hammond, a member of TM, titled The Pervasive Influence of Personalities and Ideas on Human History, given November 30th, 2014, at the request of the deceased Maharishi? George Hammond reported on the movement and shared their messages. If you've heard of this, what is your opinion on this incident and the worldview behind it?
Yes, and if this is the Ingeborg, I know her. She's the mother of a good friend of mine, Susanna Marie, who's a spiritual teacher who's been on Bat Gap a few times. Yeah, I watched that whole thing, or listened to it, as the case may be. I didn't go in person, and I heard his whole story. And he claims to have been like all these people throughout history in his previous incarnations, Plato, Socrates, I don't know if Socrates, but I don't know, just a whole bunch of them, Mark Twain, and you name it, he's been it. And so I'm very skeptical of it. He claimed that Maharishi came to him in the shower, channeled, and started giving him all these instructions that he was supposed to impart to everybody. So I'm skeptical. That's all I can say.
All right. Thank you, Rick. Tim has a question for you. He says, thank you so much for your very great talk and personal sharing. I too did TM and then joined SRF, as well as did some Zen meditation around the same time as you did. I still do them and find them very valuable. But I also agree with your assessment of the importance of ethics on the spiritual path. Why do you think there is so much of an issue experienced by many of the spiritual leaders around ethics?
Good question, Tim. Well, most of the spiritual teachers who are out there today didn't have any traditional training. They might have just been, well, almost all of them were self-appointed. I'm told that in certain Zen traditions, it was, the tradition that if you have a spiritual awakening, that the master says, great, now wait 10 years before you start to teach. And, maybe some of them have had a fair amount of traditional training, but even some of those people have behaved horrendously. Some of these Tibetan masters and others that have come to the West have just, really been bad boys. And sometimes it's written off as crazy wisdom, but I think that's a lame excuse. I have a friend named Timothy Conway who's been on Bat Gap a couple of times. He's a scholar, and he says that crazy wisdom is just a literary trope that someone cooked up, and that there really was no such history of these people beating and drinking and behaving like that. So anyway, I think we're all works in progress, and even some of the well-known spirit, well, like let's take Adyashanti for instance. I think he's very clean ethically, great guy, but he himself recently retired from teaching and announced that his body had suffered so much trauma from all the pain he had been through over the years due to whatever it was that was causing him that pain, that he was on some anti-anxiety medication. Most people wouldn't be so candid. But we all have, if I think about my life, I can think back, let's say a decade at a time, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And if I tune into where I was at each of those junctures, it's like huge contrast from one decade to the next. Maybe it's not so obvious on the surface, but in terms of my mentality at the time, I can think of how I functioned, how I behaved, how I saw the world at those different stages. And I feel like there's just been steady progress, and I'll probably be able to say the same thing 10 years from now. So I've had debates with people about the progressive versus the direct path. And there's actually a BatGap panel discussion about that. And I think that there's always going to be the progressive path, because I don't think that you can just snap your fingers and arrive at some state of complete dissolution and resolution of all of your ingrained habit patterns and tendencies, or samskaras, as they call them in Sanskrit. That takes a lifetime, maybe lifetimes, to work all that out. That's always going to be happening if you apply yourself to making it happen. But there can be the direct path, in the sense that even from day one, if you do a certain practice, you could have a clear glimpse of pure consciousness. You directly flop into it. Great. But then you have to stabilize it. And the stabilization entails purification of the whole mind-body system, which is the vehicle through which anything is experienced, especially state of enlightenment. State of enlightenment being an extraordinary subjective development would correlate with an extraordinary degree of physiological refinement in order to sustain it. And that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. So I think that people neglect that to their peril. There's another favorite quote of mine is from the Buddhist sage Padmasambhava, who was considered an avatar, just very highly enlightened. And he said, although my awareness is as vast as the sky, my attention to karma is as fine as a grain of barley flour. And what I think he meant by that is that, he's saying basically, hey, I'm a pretty cosmic dude, but I have to be really careful about the way I behave. It doesn't grant me a pass to have attained this state of consciousness that I'm in. I could screw up like anybody else could. And somebody else, Constance Casey, whom I interviewed a month ago or so, had a quote that she heard someplace, which was that we're all at different stages on the path, but we're all the same distance from the ditch. So I think that people can, fall at any time. And there are numerous instances of it in the Vedic literature, and probably in the literature of other spiritual traditions. So you have to attend to, right behavior, right action, consciously and carefully, and never take it for granted that you are above such considerations. Or, I've heard people actually get caught having been sleeping with all of their female students and then say, oh, it wasn't me, because I'm one with God, it was God doing it. Or, I'm not the actor, it was just physical bodies having sensations, and I'm not responsible, there's nothing wrong, I'm beyond right and wrong, and so on. And that to me is BS. It's just a lame alibi. Anyway, I'm probably going on a little bit too long, so I probably answered his question. If not, I can come back at you.
Thank you, Rick. That was a very elegant and I think multi-layered, deep understanding of why anybody can fall. I completely 100% agree with you. And so that being said, next question is along a slightly different angle. Your many people that you've interviewed over the years at Buddha at the gas pump. Some major insights or spiritual lessons or surprises that you've learned in interviewing all these people. Share some of that with us.
All right. Well, I'll just say what comes to mind. And that is that, well, there's a song by Paul Simon, One Trick Pony. God is not a one-trick pony. And as Jesus said, in my Father's house, there are many mansions. It says in the Bhagavad Gita that whatever, wherever in the world people show sincere aspiration for spiritual development, the Lord recognizes that and acknowledges it and supports it. And so I don't, and there's a natural human tendency to want to think that my way is the best way. Obviously, because I'm doing it, it must be the best way. If it weren't the best way, I'd be doing something else. So people do have that tendency. And it becomes quite militant at times. And, millions of people have been killed as a result of that attitude because they weren't practicing the thing that we're practicing. So I really don't think that there's any one way that is the best way. I think that now there are different ways that are perhaps more effective than others, but only if you can practice them. There's a verse in the Gita which says, because one can perform it, one's own dharma, though lesser in merit, is better than the dharma of another. The dharma of another brings danger. So, we have to kind of find something that works for us. And, perhaps the criteria of it working for us is that it's easy to do and enjoyable. Because if it isn't those two things, you're probably not going to do it. And I think regular practice is very important of some kind, of something that works for you. You've all heard about neuroplasticity, probably, about how the brain changes over time by virtue of things we do. There was a famous anecdote about some musical maestro walking down the streets of New York, and somebody came up to him and said, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And he said, practice, practice, practice. So, and ironically, there are actually some spiritual teachers, especially the Neo-Advaita types, that just say, oh, you don't need to practice because practicing, implies the existence of a practicer and you don't really exist and the world is an illusion and you're only going to reinforce your individuality if you do any kind of practice and all that stuff. I don't agree with any of that. And I could go into more elaborate responses to it, but I really do think that a regular routine in life in general, I think, is conducive to spiritual progress. Early to bed, early to rise, and there are verses again in the Gita and other scriptures about not eating too much or too little, not sleeping too much or too little, not working too hard or too little, just being balanced. Buddha said the middle way. And getting enough exercise and because again, the body is the temple of the soul. This is the vehicle through which we live our life or evolve spiritually or whatever. And you have to have a properly functioning vehicle to accomplish anything in life, which again is not to say, I said this kind of thing once at a weekend retreat someplace, and this lady who had MS or something burst into tears and said, I'm doomed, I have MS, I can't possibly make any spiritual progress. I don't think that that's true. I think that you could embark on a spiritual path on your deathbed, and it will create a momentum which will stay with you, here in the hereafter and beyond. So I think there's no bad time to start on the spiritual path. And you just, and one thing I have observed, and I'm probably rambling away from the original question, is that there's so many instances in my own experience and in the lives of people I've interviewed where the desire alone is the most pivotal thing in bringing about some kind of opportunities for spiritual growth. There's some teachers say, some gurus say, take one step toward me and I'll take 1,000 steps toward you. I think that if you have the sincere, ardent desire for the kind of thing that we're talking about here, opportunities will present themselves. Synchronicities will happen. You'll meet this person. You'll pick up, I've interviewed people who, were in a bookstore and a book just plopped off the shelf and fell on the floor and they picked it up and, oh, it was Ramana Maharshi or something. Never heard of him. And that leads to other things. So, I think that, and I could get esoteric about this. I think we're not alone in this physical realm. I think there are higher realms and intelligent entities in those realms who kind of intervene or oversee human affairs and who orchestrate to create more opportune situations for us to advance if we have the desire and the intention. There's again a verse in the Gita which says, if you support the gods, they'll support you.
Awesome. I call that the invisible fingers.
Yeah.
Behind the scenes.
You had some of that too. I mean, when you had your
had quite a bit of that in my life.
That business, yeah.
Oh yeah, very, very definite reality in my life.
I noticed somebody posted in the chat, when will this end? I think we're going on until hour, right?
Quarter past the hour.
Quarter past the hour.
Okay. The hour. Yeah. Okay. So we have a question here for you from Doug. He says, in terms of your own awakening, has it coincided with the TM's model of states of consciousness? And he says CC, GC, UC, etc.
Yeah, those stand for cosmic consciousness, God consciousness, unity consciousness. And I think they have corresponding Sanskrit names from the ancient tradition. And incidentally, I just want to interject that TM has been around. If you Google Bhavati Dhyan in Google Translate, it'll come up as Transcendental Meditation. And it's been around for centuries, if not millennia, particularly in the Shankaracharya tradition, and particularly within that tradition among a group of monks called Dandi Swamis. I have a friend named Dana Sawyer who's been on Batgap a couple of times, and he speaks fluent Hindi and has been to India many times and interviewed like hundreds of these Swamis. And I had them all initiated into meditation, and they all taught him TM. He was a TM teacher. He knew what they were teaching him. And so it's not something Maharishi invented. I think he probably learned it in his ashram when he was a student, and he was really good at marketing and had the energy and the motivation to just spread it around the world. Anyway, my own development, my own experience is, I don't claim to have achieved all those states of consciousness, although I know people who have. There's one person on this call today who says he has, and I've interviewed him too. But David Buckland, he says it in his interview, so he's not keeping it a secret. And Harry Alto, another one, and many others. But if this, I don't know if any of you have ever read the book Collision with the Infinite by Suzanne Siegel. It was an interesting thing. She was a TM teacher. She was having good experiences. She sort of drifted away from the TM movement, and she got married, and she was living in Paris, and she was pregnant, and she was just coming from a swimming session at a pool and getting on a bus when all of a sudden, boom, she just popped. She just had this shift in which she could no longer locate an individual self, and it terrified her. She's like, whoa. And she was like struggling and straining and trying to find this individual self, and she couldn't do it. And she lived in a state of fear for like 10 years. Finally she was in a meeting with Jean Klein, the French Advaita teacher, and he just basically said a few things which put her at ease, and she realized that she had actually undergone the kind of shift that she had heard about when she was a TM teacher, but her understanding of it at the time was so different from the actual experience of it that she didn't put two and two together. And that raises an important point, and I'll still get around to answering your question. That raises an important point, which is that knowledge on the path is also very important. It's not just a matter of experience. Without proper knowledge, even the experience of cosmic consciousness or some higher state could actually could cause confusion and fear. So, ethics, knowledge, practice, all these different components, which are there quite fully in some of the more august spiritual traditions, but are kind of very often lacking in some of the more contemporary forms of spirituality, are all important. So anyway, I'm a happy camper. if I had to describe my experience, I would say it is generally that I'm everywhere, I'm nowhere, and I'm right here, if you get the implication. So and we are multidimensional beings. We're not just absolute pure consciousness. We're not just physical beings. Their development of consciousness or spiritual evolution, in my understanding, is the expansion of the range or spectrum of dimensions of reality that we can incorporate within our waking life, within our conscious experience. And there is a level which is utterly silent, unmanifest, nothing ever happened, nothing is happening. There's a level which is, kind of divine and all-pervading intelligence, and everything is perfect on that level. And then there's a level of there are Sanskrit names for all these, by the way. There's a level which in Sanskrit is called Vyavaharika, which is transactional reality, ordinary stuff, people and buses and dogs and whatnot. And you have to deal with all levels accordingly and appropriately. You can't say, "Oh, this bus is an illusion. It won't matter if I step in front of it because you'll go splat." So, I guess my experience has just been an ongoing clarification and refinement of that sort of multidimensional incorporation over the years.
Awesome. Thank you, Rick. We have another question about a controversial topic, which is the use of psychedelic drugs. So someone would like to know, what are your thoughts, and have you had any negative experiences with psychedelics?
Well, yeah, I got arrested a couple times for possession back in the 60s. That was kind of negative. And, it was, I remember one time, oh man, I took acid with some people, and then somebody gave me some meth. And I took that, and I was just in a horrible state. Then I was in a very depressed, confused state for days. And I went to see the Doors in concert, and it was, despite the fact that I might have thought that fun, it was one of the most miserable nights of my life, just because I was still so traumatized by what I did. Now, of course, I'm just referring to a very reckless recreational use of drugs, and I fully appreciate the research that is being done at Johns Hopkins and NYU and many other places, and how much psychedelics are helping people with addictions, with PTSD, with end-of-life fears, and things like that, stage 4 cancer treatments. Who are terrified of death, and then they have a psilocybin trip, and it's the most beautiful experience of their lives, and they're no longer afraid of dying. So, I feel that psychedelics have their place and their promise, but there's a lot of recklessness in that field too. A lot of people just sort of doing too much without proper supervision. There are ayahuasca, retreats where women have been raped. There are, basket cases, kind of casualty cases of people. I know a girl here in town who I interviewed in the early days of Bat Gap, who was on an ayahuasca trip, and she had such an adverse reaction that she was hospitalized in mental hospitals, and she's never been the same since. So it's a powerful thing. I don't think it should be done casually or recklessly or even recreationally. And I don't think everyone should do it. I wouldn't want to do it again. I've been there, done that, but I recognize its value in the right hands for the right people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Rick.
And I've interviewed Michael Pollan, who wrote How to Change Your Mind, and along with Christopher Bache, who's a fascinating guy who did 75 heroic LSD trips. They call it heroic if you take 500 micrograms. And he had some fascinating insights. If you'd like to watch that interview, it's on Batgap.
All right. Thanks, Rick. We have another question from Paula. And Paula's question is, do you have to have a big experience to be enlightened, or can you get there gradually without any of these big experiences?
That's a good question. There's a teacher named Samuel Bonder who's been on Batgap, and he coined the phrase oozers. He said, some people have these big flashy shifts. Other people are oozers. And I think Jesus said something like the kingdom of heaven sneaks up like a thief in the night. I think that it can grow and I've heard Adyashanti talk about this too, and many others, but it can grow very incrementally so that you don't even notice what's developing, and you get used to it day by day by day. And yet, if you were to somehow, contrast what you experience now with what you experienced 20 years ago, coming or going in either direction, if you flash back to 20 years ago, even though you felt well enough then, you all of a sudden you'd feel, oh my God, what happened to me? This is horrible compared or if you could flash forward, from then to now, you think, oh my God, this is so blissful. And yet it seems kind of, it's good. I'm feeling fine. It's ordinary. So we acclimate, we grow accustomed to, mercifully, we grow accustomed to whatever we're experiencing. And probably most people, I mean, you'll have some flashy things along the way, but most people, I think that's the way it goes for them. And you should, if you're anticipating some great big fireworks, you might always be looking for that and missing the fact that you've already got something that's really valuable.
Very well put. Thank you, Rick. We now have a question from Ken, who says, since you started Batgap, the consciousness marketplace has grown tremendously in terms of similar programs and with many of the same people being interviewed. So he has two questions from this. Number one, has this affected your sense of the Batgap program's role or service? And two, do you see the AI chatbot you're developing as a way of helping navigate, select, discern the vast amount of consciousness, spiritual information now available?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's affected the Batgap program. I feel like we're all just different players on the same big team. And I actually have or had until recently, we're redesigning the website, but I had a whole big long list on Batgap of other spiritual interview shows. I'm happy to refer people to them. And I've listened to some of them myself, and I'm friends with some of the people who do them and so on. So yeah, I don't feel like they're infringing upon Batgap's territory or any such thing. We're all just helping, and we're all doing what we can, as the Beatles sang. And regarding the chat bot, and different people have different affinities. Some people hate the way I interview. They think I talk too much, and others like it. And so, if you don't like it, then maybe you'll like Jeffrey Mishlove or, Alex Tsoukaris or, one of the other spiritual interviewers, or, Yvonne Kaysen. Yeah, so regarding the chatbot, yeah, I feel like, and you've all heard stories about this, I'm sure, that AI is growing by leaps and bounds, but it's still probably in its infancy, and there's no telling what it might be able to do 5 years from now. And for those who are afraid of AI because they've heard scary stories about it, I would say that it's kind of like the internet, in the sense that, good people will do good things with it, bad people will do bad things with it. But if, in the terms of AI, if the good people are afraid of it and don't do anything with it, then the bad people will just do things. So if you can apply it to a useful purpose, I think it can be a tremendous boon, and it offers great promise in many, many different areas. And we'll see how it goes with the Batgap bot. We keep brainstorming, and there are a bunch of brilliant people behind it who, are developing it more and more on the back end, and I keep loading more and more information into it. And we keep tweaking something called the Credo, which is this marching instructions for the bot that you can modify to change its behavior. For instance, one time I just for experimentation's sake, I put in the Credo, I said, quote Beatles songs if there's any appropriate lyric that fits in with the answer. And immediately it started quoting Beatles songs. But then I took that out because I didn't want to have that in there all the time. But anyway, we keep fiddling and tweaking and trying to improve it. And, there's a page on batgap.com where you can sign up to, use it. So go ahead and do that if you like, and check it out. See if you like it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you, Rick. I look forward to seeing what you come up with that Batgap bot personally. I'm very interested. We have a comment and a question from Brian. He says, I so appreciate the level of vulnerability with which you reveal your history, thoughts, and emotions. It makes it so easy to relate to you as a human being on a spiritual journey, and the humility which acknowledges we are all works in progress. I believe these really help your message be heard and accepted. Have you deepened gradually in these qualities, or have you always been this way?
No, Brian. I mean, if you heard the whole interview today, I was a pretty messed up little kid, or young man, and I mean, I wasn't a bad person. I wasn't, I don't think, intentionally cruel or violent or anything like that. But I was very confused and mixed up and unhappy and lost in many ways, and you know, non-functional in many ways. And so, I've just when I was 18, I just had this aha moment where I thought, okay, I'm going to turn this around, because I don't like the way it's going. And so I just started one step at a time, doing what I could to live a more constructive life and, meditate regularly and eat better and exercise better and, not consume damaging substances and, all that stuff. And it's just, it's grown over the years.
Mhm, mhm. Yes, I like the term that you said earlier on, that we're all a work in progress. That's what
Yeah.
I've been saying for years. I'm still a work in progress, and we're all a work in progress.
And Saint Teresa, that quote from her, that God is a work in progress. So we're in
So
good company.
yeah, we're in good company. So we have a question here from Joe, who says, Sufi Master Pir Vilayat Inayat Khan has stated, awakening beyond life can never be the final goal of spiritual practice. It has to be followed by awakening in life. Oh, I see. Did I read this
No,
incorrectly?
that makes
Awakening
sense.
beyond life should not be
Right.
the goal, but followed by awakening in life. Would you and others that you've interviewed tend to agree with this perspective?
I do. There's a comedian named Stephen Wright. If you like comedians, check out Stephen Wright. Anyway, he had one joke where he said, he has this deadpan way of speaking, but he said, I broke up with my girlfriend. I wasn't really into meditation, and she really wasn't into being alive. Um, so, I think that I see spiritual development not as a way of escaping from anything, but actually as a way of living life more fully. One of Marshi's favorite slogans was 200% of life, 100% inner spiritual, 100% outer material. And most of us are not monks by our inclinations. We're not going to go retreat to a cave or anything. And if we actually practice a meditation or some kind of spiritual practice that makes us start doing that, and it's not really in tune with our tendencies, it could actually retard our spiritual practice, our spiritual growth. So I think that spiritual, here's a way of explaining it. And this won't be unfamiliar to all of you. This inner reservoir of pure consciousness, or whatever we want to call it, is generally regarded as being a vast repository of intelligence, creativity, bliss. And so the spiritual path can just be seen as a matter of tapping into that and then infusing it more and more into the more manifest aspects of our life, the mind, the senses, the intellect, all these things. And so that will naturally result in greater success in life if that's what we're really doing. We should be, better students, better pickleball players, better violin players or whatever, if we have access to deeper reservoir of intelligence and creativity and energy. And that's been my experience, at least with the pickleball. I'm not a tennis player. I mean, I'm not a musician anymore.
Mhm. Awesome. Okay. So I think we're going to wrap up. We've had a number of comments about how much people absolutely loved your presentation today, Rick. And that they wish you'd be teaching. You'd make a great spiritual guide.
Aren't I teaching?
You are teaching right now, absolutely.
And also in
And
the interviews, although I try to keep my mouth shut, but I get in some little nuggets.
you do. I noticed that during my interview. But I'd like to wrap up with, what are your future plans? Do you have any ideas in the back of your head in addition to the AI bot? Like, are you thinking of a book? Are you thinking of a movie?
I may at some point use AI to help write a book because, I have all these interviews and all the transcripts of them. And then I have a lot of little things that I've written. And then I save them. If it's just some email to somebody or some little thing that I think, well, this would be worth saving. So I save it. And then I have hours of conversations that I've had with people that I recorded, just private conversations where we're pontificating and philosophizing about things. I've saved all that stuff. And AI is getting to the point where you can plop all that in to an AI and then say, write me a chapter on such and such in my writing style, based upon all this material I've just given you. And it'll take a few seconds and give you that. And then I could go over it and, actually refine it and make sure it's the way I want it to be. So it is actually something I've literally written. So I might use some technique like that to write a book at some point. And it would probably be a book that consists of, shorter essays on different aspects or different topics that wouldn't necessarily have to be read cover to cover, but this, that, and the other thing, different reflections and observations that I've come up with over the years. So we'll see, but I can barely even clean out my inbox on any given day. In fact, it hasn't been cleaned out in months. So I don't know. I'll have to be a little bit better at time management before I get around to writing a book. Plus, there's so many other things going on besides Bat Gap. I mean, we have dogs to walk and grass to cut and all the usual things that life throws at you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rick, for an absolutely fabulous presentation. It's been absolutely wonderful. And I know everyone here is very, very appreciative of your openness, of your spiritual wisdom that you've acquired over the years, and in your humility in expressing what your spiritual journey was like, the ups and downs and the rough patches in the beginning, and the conclusion that we're all works in progress. So thank you so much for an absolutely fabulous presentation, Rick.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to those who've been watching, and stay in touch, everybody.
Yes, just as we close, could you tell everybody how they can get in touch with you, please? Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't want to get inundated with emails, but my email address is rick@batgap.com. But I don't have time for a lot of chit chat, because I said there's a flood of emails, and I can't, and a lot of them represent projects that take a lot more time than answering an email. But occasionally I'll have conversations with somebody while I'm walking in the woods or something, and if they really feel the need to talk, and I've made some good friends that way, and so I'm theoretically open to that kind of thing, but I just can't promise anything because of time constraints.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rick. It's been absolutely fabulous.